All right, this is going to be clever tonight because Scott's going to walk around and we're still going to have that thing going, so we'll see how it works. Welcome, everyone. My name is Terry Bristol. I'm the president of the Institute for Science, Engineering, and Public Policy. This is the 2009-2010 Linus Pauling Memorial Lectures. This is the fifth of six. May 6th is another one. This is Wednesday night, so I hope we didn't lose too many people who think it's tomorrow night. We'll see. I hope we made that clear. Everybody, will you check your cell phones and so forth? And my major role here, minor role, is to say thank you to the co-sponsors that make this all possible. And our, first of all, is Mentor Graphics Corporation, which has been our major corporate co-sponsor for some time, bringing this, some people, visionaries out there who understand adding cultural value to the city of Portland. So thank you to Mentor Graphics in particular. And we also have partnerships with Oregon Episcopal School, good people there, FEI Company, Portland State University, University of Oregon, Western Oregon University, Portland Community College, University of Portland, Clark College in Vancouver, Onami, which is our nanotech group. This is creating many companies who will employ these young people here. FLIR Systems, and Scott was actually out at FLIR yesterday scaring them about things, but never mind. And Pacific University, Reed College, and the Oregonian. And then, of course, I always have to add that we have a very generous grant from Mentor Graphics Foundation, which is completely separate from the corporation, that subsidizes the tickets for the K-12 and community college people. So thank you very much for that. Yes? Okay, so tonight it's my pleasure. We got a person who's going to introduce Scott Borg is John Lester Miller, who's with FLIR. He has 30 years experience in infrared physics, has worked at Mount Wilson and Mount Palomar observatories. I'm very jealous. I had hoped to be an astronomer at some point in my life. He's worked also at Rockwell and Mauna Kea observatories in Hawaii. He was with Martin Marietta for a while, and now is the Chief Technology Officer at FLIR. He has degrees in physics, astronomy, as well as an MBA. Sits on 2 national committees on infrared technology. He's written 4 books, 60 technical papers, 3 patents. Anyway, he's a very impressive guy, and he's also a card and a great guy, and we really appreciate the support from FLIR. And when you get a support from a company, I always say you have an internal champion, someone understands the value of this, and to me, this is John Miller, and so please welcome John.
Thank you, Terry. Good evening, Portland. We have a very interesting speaker tonight that also may be kind of dark and kind of dismal, and probably will end up scaring all of you as he has recently scared us. Scott Borg is an expert on cyber attacks. Cyber attacks militarily have been around in conventional wars at least since the Panama invasion in the 1980s. In the first Gulf War, the U.S. actually sent emails to Iraqi military officials asking them to surrender. And it was actually quite successful. A lot of them did. Russia recently did cyber attacks when they invaded Georgia. Israel defeated the Syrian air defenses when they bombed that Syrian nuclear facility, not by bombing the air defenses, but rather by a cyber attack on them. And it's not just nation states. In Iraq last summer, Iranian-backed insurgents were able to use a $26 software package to download infrared and video and visible video from the Predator aircrafts. One can imagine a world where an entire war is fought using this type of technology. In fact, we could even go one step further. Let's think about what Hollywood has been telling us for decades about aliens invading us. And they come down, they bomb us, and they laser us. Maybe they don't do that. Maybe just shut off everything digitally and come in and take over. Remember on Star Trek, the Borg? Remember, they were half human, half machine, and had collective intelligence with superhuman power. The only way you could defeat them was with a cyber attack. Tonight's speaker is Scott Borg. He works on these large-scale cyber warfare and the resulting economic consequences. In fact, his job is to decide how America can easily be attacked and then try to prevent it. He heads the U.S. Cyber Consequences Unit, which is an independent nonprofit research institute. It provides assessment of strategic and economic consequences of possible cyber attacks. Our Speakers Institute is primarily concerned with the sort of larger attacks that could be mounted by criminal organizations, terrorist groups, nation states, and rogue companies. He was a member of the Cyber Commission for the 44th presidency and is one of the most cited experts on cyber warfare. He has written several books and several papers. In addition to leading the U.S. Cyber Consequence Unit, he is a senior research fellow of the International Security Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Portland, please welcome Scott Borg. You will be assimilated.
The 9/11 Commission report said that the chief failure was a failure of imagination. It was a failure of imagination, not of imagining the future so much as imagining the world we're in now, imagining the present. And that's what I'm going to try to get you to do this evening, is imagine the world that we're now in. This is surprisingly hard, so in an attempt to make it easier, I'm going to ask you first to try to imagine what the beginning of the nuclear era, the nuclear defense era, would have been like if we'd not had a Hiroshima. It could easily have happened. General Grove, who was responsible for the Manhattan Project, could have enforced tighter security measures on the scientists, kept them from talking to each other so much, and delayed the actual completion of the atom bomb by several months. Truman could have offered different surrender terms to the Japanese, and they might have surrendered more earlier. So we could easily have ended World War II without ever having detonated an atomic bomb. So imagine what that world would have been like. Probably the people who developed the bomb would have set up a demonstration explosion or two. They would have probably invited a lot of politicians, some businessmen, some other leaders, and assembled them out someplace in the desert and exploded a nuclear weapon. And the people who visited, the people who attended this demonstration probably would have said, oh, wow, that's incredible, that's amazing, gee, that's just like nothing we've ever seen before. And probably they would have gone back pretty much to business as usual. The Defense Department would have announced a nuclear transformation initiative and a new nuclear command and a new nuclear force, and they probably never would have funded it very well or followed through sufficiently. When the news got out into the media, a lot of people with degrees in physics and engineering would have announced that chain reactions were impossible, that nuclear weapons were too difficult to ever produce. People, public commentators would have probably said, oh, it's just completely implausible that something so small could produce such a big effect, produce such a big explosion. And they would have done a lot of ad hominem attacks on the people trying to warn about nuclear threat. They probably would have said, oh, they're just trying to scare people to advance some political agenda or just trying to get funding for their research or who knows what. And very likely, we would have found ourselves maybe in 1957 waking up not to have a Sputnik overhead, but to be surrounded by nuclear weapons without any good program for dealing with them or any coherent strategy for this era. I would like to argue right now that we are in a very similar position with cyber attacks, with cyber warfare, that we've entered a cyber defense era without a Hiroshima, and we have people who've done all the things I just described them hypothetically doing had we entered the nuclear era without a Hiroshima. We've had demonstration explosions. We've had the equivalent. We've had demonstration cyber attacks. One of them, a couple of them I can't talk about except to say vaguely what they were. One of them I can talk about because CNN got a videotape of it and posted it, broadcast it and posted it, and you can find it online, and a lot is known about it. This was a demonstration where the got a large generator, not one quite as large as we would use to actually generate electric power, but one large enough to be a stand-in for those, a truck-sized generator. And they took this truck-sized generator and they hooked it up to the same kind of control systems, the same computers and such that a real generator would be hooked up to. And they invited in an audience, and while the cameras were running, they proceeded to physically destroy that generator with a pure cyber attack. If you watch the video and you listen to what people have said about it, you can get a fair idea of what happened. You can watch the thing shaking more and more, going out of control. You can watch something really crunch. You can watch the thing smoking. It's fairly clear from watching just the video that what happened was the rotor hit the stator, shredded it, caught fire, the shaft was bent, the whole thing was physically destroyed. This is a cyber attack that can be fully automated. It's scalable. It's an attack that you could run against not just one system at a time, but 20, 40, 60, 200 systems at once. You could destroy many, many generators simultaneously with this attack. It works better the bigger the generator. If you've got a really huge generator, like the ones in Grand Coulee Dam, there are 6 generators in that giant mile-long dam. Those generators are easier to destroy with this kind of attack than the one they used for the demonstration. If you destroyed a large number of generators, you could essentially eliminate the electric power, eliminate the electric power for a large portion of the United States. Maybe a third of it, maybe half of it. We don't have any adequate way of getting electric power to the West Coast, for instance, if it can't generate its own power. There aren't enough transmission lines. And, of course, if somebody really wanted to carry out an attack like this, a good thing to do would be to also destroy the transmission lines. It takes about 2 years to replace a large generator component. Almost all of the large generator components are made in China or India. World capacity is very limited. We've done exercises where we've assembled a lot of engineers and we've asked, okay, what can we do if something like this happens? How fast can we commandeer facilities, set up production, fly in the requisite expertise from Germany and Austria where they still know how to do this sort of thing, expand the facility, restart the facility that GE was running in Schenectady and down in the Carolinas. And we've done brainstorming and talked about how long would it take to replace large generator components. And we can't figure out any way to do this that would take less than 6 months or more on the average, probably considerably more than that. If you shut down electricity for about 3.5 days, it costs amazingly little. In fact, if you see quotes for how it cost $1 gazillion to shut down electricity for the electric power outage in August of '03, if you see some enormous number, it's completely bogus. Despite lean supply chains, just-in-time delivery, and so on, our whole economy is set up to cope with long weekends very well. Everywhere in our economy, we have about 3.5 days of extra inventory. We also, even if we're running at, say, 90% capacity, you can make up 3 lost days by the end of the month in 30 days. So if you shut down things for 3.5 days, it costs amazingly little. Now, there are a few industries that are hurt right away. Betting houses are hurt. Brokerage firms suffer immediately. They deal in extreme perishables in economic terms. Airlines are hurt. A few other industries that deal in extreme perishables suffer right away. But mostly, our economy is not damaged significantly by a 3.5, 4-day outage of almost anything. If the electricity's out for longer than that, after about 4 days, the backup generators that didn't already burn out, a lot of the backup generators are going to burn out right away because they're only tested for 20 minutes a month without a load. And so you start running them for hours at full load, a lot of them are going to burn out and stop functioning. But after about 4 days or so, they're going to start, the ones that are working properly are going to start running out of fuel. The inventory everywhere is going to start running out. The people who can function without electric power to a considerable degree are all going to be dependent on somebody else, some other supplier, something else that needs electric power. So everything's going to start shutting down. We did a number of exercises where we had people think through every workaround, every ingenious device for managing without electricity that they could think of. We assumed that people would use hand-operated bilge pumps from boats to get gasoline out of underground storage facilities. We assumed that people would all figure out how to run bits of essential electronics off of batteries and small generators and so on. We imagined that everybody was going to be really ingenious and really, old Yankee ingenuity and all of that to keep things going. And we couldn't figure out how we could stop most of the economy from shutting down. And in fact, after about 8 to 10 days, as far as we can tell, over 72% of all economic activity as measured by GDP shuts down. The remaining economic activity, the remaining portion of GDP that's still being supplied are things that we don't ordinarily think of as business activity. It's things like the value you receive from occupying your house or apartment, even though you're in the dark. So if it's winter, you don't have heating. Most heating systems don't work without electricity, even if people are using diesel fuel. If it's summer, you don't have air conditioning. Not only do you not have emergency services for the most part, and vital supplies and medical supplies and things like that, very soon you don't have safe food, you don't have clean drinking water, you don't have other things that you need. So if you do this for a large area for an extended period of time, it causes tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of deaths. It is a level of destruction comparable only to nuclear exchanges. It is a greater level of destruction than any modern country has ever suffered. It is hugely greater than all the damage we did to Japan and Germany during World War II by strategic bombing. It is just horrendous. You can accomplish pretty much the same thing by shutting down oil and gas. There was a cyber attack. There was also another demonstration at one of the national labs that I can't talk much about, but essentially demonstrated how you would blow up a refinery with a cyber attack. You could blow up lots of refineries at once with cyber attacks. I mean, it's not all that hard. A refinery is full of explosive materials, highly flammable stuff. You just cause a leak near an ignition source, and you can set the thing burning. So it's not hard to figure out how you do it. Pipelines can all be, almost all pipelines can be blown by cyber attacks. In order to operate efficiently, the pumps in a pipeline have to be able to move things along fast enough so that if you immediately blocked the flow, it would blow the walls of the pipeline. We can't afford to have fortified walls throughout our gas pipelines or our oil pipelines. So in order to work, the pumps that are actually there in the pipeline working all the time have enough power to explode the pipeline if you block it and you make the pumps pump toward each other and you do things like that. If you shut off oil and gas, it takes longer than 10 days for everything else to shut down. It takes almost 3 weeks. But after about 3 weeks, the economy shuts down almost as much as if you shut down electricity. There are similar attacks on most of the other critical infrastructure industries. You can mess with the banking system extraordinarily. You can make credit cards not work, ATMs not work, cash clearing, check clearing houses not work. You can shut down just about every part of the banking system with a cyber attack. You can mess with telecommunications if you want. Railways, people look at railways and they look like they're not high tech. And in fact, railways are pretty low tech out there, on the rail yards and across country. But railways now are run out of command centers that look like mission control out of a Hollywood movie. They are extraordinarily high tech in the way the trains are actually sent on their different paths and the way the switching systems work and so on. It is quite doable to run a cyber attack that would not only crash trains into each other, but crash them in tunnels, on bridges, in inconvenient places. So you get the idea. I can run through most of the critical infrastructure industries and describe the kinds of attacks that are possible. The organization I run investigates these. I'm not talking from hearsay or speculation or, gee, it might be cool if. It's our job to go around and visit physical facilities, look at the equipment, set up things for testing, and actually find out which of these attacks are possible. Many of the attacks that you've seen in Hollywood movies that you've heard about, we've discovered are not possible. You can't make the traffic lights go green both ways at the same time, for instance. They're not wired in a way that allows you to do that, and so on. There are many things that you've probably heard about that you can't do. You can't explode nuclear facilities with an atomic explosion. You can't launch missiles with a pure cyber attack. There are many things you can't do, but you can wreck just about anything in the critical infrastructure. You can ground all the airplanes. You can spoof the positions of airplanes for flight controls. You can actually take control of the screens in flight control centers and make them see anything you want that you want them to see while you do something else with the airplanes. You can even spoof geopositioning on automobiles. Some French hackers at DEF CON, the hacker convention a couple years ago, showed how you could take a local device, attach it perhaps to the underside of a police car, and send the police car's geopositioning system any signals you wanted, send it in any direction you want. So you get the idea. This is extraordinary. If you can do this kind of damage with a pure cyber attack, if you can do this level of destruction, why would you bother to invade a country? Why would you bother with missiles? Why would you bother with any kind of incoming troops? If you're going to attack a country, what you're going to mostly focus on is the critical infrastructure industries, the ones I've just been describing. If you need to defend a country, that's what you most need to defend. So you should be seeing already, this has really drastic implications for defense. This changes how we think about defending countries altogether. Up until now, our whole defensive strategy, the whole way we think about it, has all been about defending borders, defending boundaries, defending perimeters. We had DEW lines, defense early warning lines. We have, we positioned troops to defend the line that Russian tanks would presumably cross if they were invading Europe. We defend borders. That's what we're set up to do. We're set up to repel invaders, repel incomings. What we are not set up for is to defend an attack that emerges from inside our own computers, inside our own critical infrastructure industries, that just erupts from inside everything, inside our borders, inside the fabric of the nervous system, in a sense, that we use to control everything. A modern factory, a modern chemical plant, refinery, anything like that, is controlled entirely by computers. There are a few exceptions, but by and large, every valve, switch, pressure, temperature, it's all computer controlled. If it's computer controlled, it can be subject to a cyber attack. You've probably heard a lot of talk over the years about viruses and worms. I was recently talking to a staffer for one of the congressmen who's just moved into a position of responsibility for this area. The congressman was being given some background, told about viruses and worms and things, and I'm going, oh my God, this is so out of date. We are now into things that are so beyond viruses and worms. We are into things that they're not even like computer rats. They're computer golems. There are attack tools that are so beyond what people are used to thinking about. And just viruses and worms are already straining people's imagination. When we introduced nuclear weapons, we were introducing things that military people pretty much knew how to deal with. An atom bomb looks like an ordinary bomb. It's a big one, but it looks similar. It has a detonator. It has something that's analogous to fuel. It destroys things by a blast of heat and expanding gases. It's something that you can drop out of an airplane. You can look at it. You can see it. It's like a conventional weapon, relatively speaking. A cyber attack weapon, you can't see it. It has no weight. People talk metaphorically about, oh, computers can be weapons, but actually the computer is the environment in which a cyber weapon operates. The cyber weapon is just some instructions. Some instructions. So we're into a world where the weapons are instructions. The tools that can do these incredibly destructive things, these amazing things, are lines of code. They're instructions. And they can operate. They can operate to the limits of what you can imagine them doing. So, for example, a particular piece of a category of malware that my organization captured and analyzed a couple of years ago that's been plaguing American defense systems for the last year and a half and has now been intruding into lots of critical infrastructure industries and defense contractors. It's a kind of malware that will migrate from device to device. It doesn't need an internet connection. If you plug something with this malware into a computer and you just open it up to see what's there, you don't have to run anything or click on anything, you just have to open the device up to see what's there, it will copy itself into the device it's plugged into, and it will migrate from device to device, copying itself into each new thing that's connected to something else. And as it does that, it will, each time it copies itself, it mutates. So it changes its signatures. So you can't have a nice description of what to look for to find it. It hides in the boot space of a computer. It hides at such a basic level that you can't look at what's in the machine and see it anywhere. It doesn't show up on any window that's listing the things that are operating there. A very large portion of the program in this piece of malware is devoted to covering its tracks so that it will alter logs and registries as it goes. So even when it's active and actively doing something, it's constantly erasing the traces of what it's done. So it's just extraordinarily hard to find. The one that we captured and some of the ones that have been plaguing the military were targeted to collect certain types of information. They would go after certain categories of information. They would, when they finally found that information, they would capture it, compress it, encrypt it, and then carry it in a packet with the malware as it migrated from device to device until it finally found itself on something connected to the internet, at which point it would send the stuff home. So this is a piece of malware that it becomes whatever it needs to be in each situation that it's in to accomplish its mission. We suspect the existence of a similar kind of tool that is not designed to collect information, but is designed to find itself into critical infrastructure, control systems such as the ones for electric power, and embed itself in programs that are already in there as though it were a patch, as though it were a revision to the program. And it could do this malware, in a way that would not be localized in any place, in any single place. It would insert itself in a lot of different places in the program that it was effectively turning into a Trojan, so that you could do a line-by-line audit of that program and not find it. Because the malware would be telling the program to do things the program would ordinarily do: open valves, close valves, open switches, turn off switches. But it would do it at exactly the wrong time. It would do it at the time when you least wanted that thing to happen. And the mal part of the malware, the thing that makes it bad, would be in when the subroutine was triggered. It would be in what would be essentially the go-to instructions for those of you who are used to programming. So you can't, in the time of human history, track down all of those go-to instructions. You can't find it. And you can't find it in an automated way for the same reason that machine translation is very limited. Machines don't know the implications of things. Machines can't figure out what something would mean in different contexts. So the machine can't recognize the malware. Now, I said we suspect this exists because we are looking at these programs and we can't find it. We can't tell for sure whether it's there. We had other clues that suggest to us that something of this kind might have been dispatched into these systems, but we don't really know. So we've got malware that will do anything you want, anything you can imagine. It doesn't need internet connections. And it doesn't need large volume. You've heard a lot of talk about botnets and perhaps distributed denial of service attacks. These kinds of things have even made mass media. But the things that keep me up at night, the things that worry my colleagues and me the most, are low volume attacks. They're things where you just would launch something in a very limited number of locations with a limited number of targets, and it would migrate and it would do other things and it would reproduce itself, but it doesn't need a large volume to have its effect. And as a result, it's extremely hard to find. This also means, by the way, that a lot of the programs, surveillance programs, web internet monitoring programs that the politicians have been talking about, things they think that the NSA should be authorized to do, while they might have some uses, they have no use for trying to catch the sort of thing I've just been describing to you. In this world, anonymity is a fact of life. Anonymous internet access is very easy to have, and there's no way to make it hard to have. You can right now buy a laptop, buy a smartphone, buy something that will allow you to get on the internet. You can get on the internet anonymously in most hotel lobbies. In the McDonald's I noticed a couple blocks from here. You can sit on a commuter train going through suburbs and have free anonymous internet access as you go across people's backyards. You can sit in a bus in a big city, in the back of the bus with a little antenna, and have anonymous internet access. You can do this all over the world. If somebody figures out how to track you back to a piece of equipment, you buy a piece of equipment that you can dispose of. If you try to institute a program of national identifications, there's a crew of people in the Pentagon who want us all to have ID cards like driver's licenses with little strips on them and biometric information, and they want us to use these every time we sign on to the internet. The problem with plans like this is that it would make it very easy to track ordinary people who are not trying to do anything covert, not trying to do anything sinister. But none of the systems that anybody has thought up so far, none of the systems anybody has come up with are any good at tracking anybody who doesn't want to be tracked. They're not good at depriving anyone of anonymity who wants to be anonymous. And we've been for years hearing different proposals, and usually we can quickly come up with some way to circumvent them. So we're operating in a world where the attack tools are the limits of what you can imagine, where anonymity is normal, it's a fact of life, just something we have to live with. It's also a world where attacks operate on probabilities, and often where really unlikely things are very practical. In the ordinary world, if you've got an attack that only works a very small percentage of the time, it's not very, it's not something that you want to do. There isn't a lot of use for it. In the cyber world, you can have an attack that only works 1 out of 10,000 times, and it's eminently practical because you can launch that attack 10 million times. If you have a way of stealing money that only steals a few fractions of a cent, you can make a huge amount of money as an internet crook because you can steal a few fractions of a cent from millions of people. A whole different way of thinking is required to deal with this world with these kinds of attack tools, to get used to what the possibilities are, what you can think about. One of the consequences is that any conflict once it reaches a certain level, is now likely to have a cyber component. Anytime you've got escalating hostilities, anytime you've got one group in some part of the world that's discontent, it's quite likely that there will be a set of cyber attacks trying to advance the interests of that group, and often counterattacks. Countries have been able to take advantage of this. I think John, who was introducing me, referred to a couple of cyber campaigns that were carried out. I think he mentioned the one against Estonia and the one against Georgia. Both of those were carried out by civilians. The one against Georgia we know all about. When Georgia was being invaded by Russia, there was a cyber attack that coincided. Georgia had no idea what to do about this, so they phoned Laurie Ullman, the permanent Minister of Defense from Estonia, because they remembered Estonia had had an experience that was like this. Laurie phoned me, so I was in the middle of this from as soon as people knew that it was happening. For quite a while, I was the only ranking cybersecurity expert that they could reach, because this was the weekend of Black Hat and DEF CON, the big hacker conventions, and most of the ranking cybersecurity people were out in Las Vegas drunken with hangovers. So for a while, I was trying to figure out all by myself how to put all this together and who to put them in touch with and how to manage all of this. It wasn't really all by myself, because they were also phoning other people and getting advice from other sources. But an informal network of us were advising them and telling them basically what they needed to deal with. As a result of that, my organization was able to figure out exactly what happened at every stage, and partly because the actors in that cyber campaign made no attempt to conceal their identities, really. They concealed their individual identities, but not their generic identities. A large portion of the attack was carried out by Russian organized crime. They wanted credit for this. They wanted to show they were patriotic Russians, so they didn't cover their tracks. Another large portion of the campaign was carried out with attack tools that were posted on social networking websites, dating websites, discussion, hobbyist websites, gun collector websites, phishing websites. The Russian government orchestrated this somehow, because the attack started in the early hours of the morning, not long after the Russian tanks started rolling into Georgia, and it did things right off the bat that revealed weeks and weeks of preparation. Lots of advanced work. So we had spontaneous civilian support for the Russian invasion of Georgia starting early in the morning and immediately taking out exactly the targets the Russian military would have wanted to have taken out, like communication centers, media outlets, and then later on it moved on to banks and government targets and so on. So we had, and the Russians didn't bother to do airstrikes on these things. Ordinarily, if you're invading a country, the first thing you do is an airstrike to take out communication facilities. The Russians didn't need to, because they knew the cyber attacks were about to do it. So we had very, very well-coordinated set of attacks on a country that the Russian government and Russian military didn't carry out, so they had deniability. They could say, it was just civilians coming to the defense of Russia. Chinese have done this various times. The Russians have done this several times over. So we have a world where we can have cyber attacks being used by countries to advance their interests without those countries needing to acknowledge any responsibility, even when they haven't made use of the ability to be anonymous on the internet. In this world, relatively small groups can mount attacks that rise to the level of being national security concerns. A criminal organization, a small group of fanatics, the millionaire next door that they talked about back when we were prosperous in America could finance a cyber attack destructive enough to be a serious threat to a large nation state. People used to talk about asymmetrical warfare. This is asymmetrical beyond what they ever dreamed of. We've had a number of cases where senior officials in America and Europe have talked about attacks publicly that they attributed to nation states. They said, you know, this is a serious attack against America, and they had various nice names for them, code names for them, and they talked about how bad they were and assumed that it had to be Russia or it had to be China. And they were later embarrassed to discover that one of them, for instance, was two Swedish teenagers. Another one was a couple of kids in the Philippines. These weren't as destructive as the kind that I've been talking about earlier, but we can have something done by a very small group that is really scary, really destructive. So this just changes all the things that we used to do to think about security. And by the way, there are all kinds of ways of profiting from cyber attacks. So not only do we have the potential of small groups doing these things, this is a real worry. If you can cause any very significant event, any event that has economic consequences, you can make a huge amount of money off of it. If you can make any market, make any kind of abrupt change, and you know in advance what that change will be, there's huge profits to be made. So you could attack a company producing a commodity, and suddenly that commodity is going to be a lot more valuable. You can attack a company that's consuming a commodity, and suddenly the commodity will become a lot less valuable. You can attack a corporation, an airline, for example, and go short on the airline's stock, and you can make 100% profit on your investment for every dollar the stock falls. You can reinvest on the way down if it's a controlled fall and multiply your investment by many more times than that. You can take a stock that's trading at, you know, $57 or $8 and multiply your investment for sure by $50 as it goes down to $1 as you bankrupt it. If you're lucky and you are able to invest effectively on the way down, you can multiply your investment by a couple hundred times easily. If you do that, the companies that were hurt, the financial sector, the company that you watched go down, those companies might send a hitman after you, but they can't prosecute you because what you did in that investment was legal. Unless they can prove that you were the person who actually conspired to carry out that attack, it's perfectly legal to say that you heard a rumor there was going to be a cyber attack, you expected there might be one, and you decided to go short on that stock. You decided to make the leverage bet on that commodity. We've already seen this kind of cyber attack being carried out in a small-scale way. I didn't used to talk about this one in public at all. I never breathed a word about this, even though we'd been thinking about it and watching it for years. But now, this kind of attack is being discussed on the internet in Russian and Arabic and Punjab and Tagalog and who knows how many other languages. So now I think we're going to start seeing more of this kind of thing. So this is the world we're moving into. We're moving into a world where all kinds of groups can do all kinds of havoc and profit by it in all kinds of ways. Advance their causes, support their local industries by knocking out competing industries, set themselves up for profits by indirect payoff financial crimes, by bets on the market. And along the way, of course, do just horrendous damage. I'm spoiled for choice here as to where to go next with this. You can see, I think, that the implications fan out from here. That once you start thinking about what happens here, about what the possibilities are, what the implications are, it ramifies in so many directions. All of the things that we used to think about when we were talking about security and strategy and defense all have to be rethought. So for example, throughout the nuclear era, our whole defense was based on deterrence, based on a particular kind of retribution deterrence. But if our attackers can be civilian populations dispersed across a large area, and if our attackers can be completely anonymous, so we don't know whether it was China or whether it was Tibetans trying to make us think it was China, so we would attack China, or some other mischief maker with a crazy cause just trying to cause conflict in that part of the world. We don't know who did any of these things. Deterrence isn't really a very good idea anymore. We've had some politicians recently talking about, oh, we have to preserve the nuclear option in case of cyber attack. Yeah, well, thing is, you're not going to know who did the cyber attack unless they want you to know, and even then you won't know whether to trust them. There isn't a credible formula for what kind of physical attack would be proportionate to a given cyber attack. If you attack back with a cyber attack, we're in this realm of probabilities and where you're dealing with things where there's a lot of uncertainty about what the consequences are going to be. There are likely to be a lot of unintended consequences as you start destroying interlocking systems out there. So deterrence, it's not going to work anymore. Pentagon can't stand this. They're putting huge amounts of money into what they call solving the attribution problem. I was at the RSA convention a few weeks ago out in San Francisco, and we had a little vote at the end of the convention of what were the 10 dumbest things we heard in the course of the convention. And near the top of the list, one of the dumbest things of all was the quote, "as soon as we solve the attribution problem." Another one that was on the list was, "I'm sure there's a cyber equivalent of mutually assured destruction, isn't there?" Anyway, you get the idea. It was all the Cold War rhetoric, all the nuclear era rhetoric being reintroduced in cyber terms, people trying to find cyber equivalents. And there aren't any, just as there wasn't mutually assured destruction prior to nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons inaugurated a whole vocabulary, a whole theory of conflict and a theory of strategy, of military strategy that was not like what we'd seen previously. Cyber is inaugurating a whole set of concepts that are even more different, even more profoundly different than the ones that were introduced by nuclear weapons. Where does this leave us? Where is this going? Well, for instance, if we can't talk about deterrence, we need to start talking about resilience. We have deterrence alliances. We now need to start thinking about resilience alliances. What do I mean? I talked about the generator attack, and I said that the large generator components are nowadays produced almost exclusively in China and India. When we have talked through, in these various tabletop exercises we do, critical infrastructure attacks, we invariably find that no country can cope with serious attacks on its critical infrastructure itself because everybody's dependent on a global supply chain. The United States does the best. We have the most comprehensive economy. We have more of what we need within our own borders than anybody else. And yet, generator components come from India and China. Large transformers aren't made in America anymore. They are actually mostly made in India and China too, but in a few other parts of the world. There are many, many components, long lists, in fact. One of the things my organization does is it makes up these lists, long lists of things that we can't supply any longer domestically because global supply chains have spread the manufacturing, the production of these things all around the world. So in order to cope with cyber attacks, in order to make them less destructive, we need to be organizing alliances to supply missing pieces in cooperation with other countries, especially our traditional European allies. We need to be engineering systems that aren't so fragile. We need to build an electric power systems where there isn't a single avenue of attack that will get you to all the targets, where the system can modularize itself and basically separate itself into separately functioning units so that the whole thing isn't just one giant fragile piece, and so on. You can work through most of the critical infrastructure industries and actually make lists of things that you would do to make these systems more resilient. One of the benefits of this is that the systems become more resilient for everything else. They are less vulnerable to anything else that could happen to them that would be bad, because you're building in, much of the time, substitutors, alternative systems, understudy systems, really. Understudy systems because they're systems that wouldn't be lying idle all the time. They would just be doing something else and then be promoted to their more critical use when you needed them. So a bunch of us have been trying to evolve a theory of resilience and resilience alliances and resilience strategy. And a lot of people are working on this. But this isn't reaching the general public. This is not something that's entered popular discussion. In fact, I don't think most of the things I've been talking about are really out there in public discussion very much. And that's one of the reasons why I was eager to talk today to this group. Not only is the public not adequately thinking about these things, but it's actively getting in the way. For instance, one of the electrical companies, actually more than one of the electrical companies on more than one occasion, has applied to the regulatory commissions to get a few fractions of a cent added to the electric charges so they could make themselves secure against some of the cyber attacks, or more secure against some of the cyber attacks I've just been describing. And they were turned down by the regulatory commissions because the politicians sitting on those didn't understand that this was a real problem and a real worry. They thought it was a ruse on the part of the electrical companies to just, up their rates. We have right now in Washington a big movement to do something about some of these issues. A lot of legislation is being passed around, and I've been to some degree involved in that and testifying before the Senate and offering alternative drafts of some of these bills and so on. But it's a terribly frustrating thing to try to do because the public at large has no idea why this is important really, and what's really going on. And the politicians, who are generally people, not techies, and pride themselves in having other people do their email for them, they want a quick, easy solution. They're going to have a mandatory thing that just requires everybody to meet a certain standard of cybersecurity or something, and then that will solve the problem. They want immediate, just pass a bill and regulate people better. The problem with that, and one of the reasons that we need public discussion of this whole issue, is that it's not possible for the government to mandate good cybersecurity. The government can only mandate poor cybersecurity. And the reason is that by the time you've identified a standard and gotten it through whatever bodies need to approve it and agree on it and begun to impose it, it's going to be not only out of date, not only obsolete, but an active impediment to doing what you need to do because the field is evolving so fast. So if there was ever an area where we needed creative problem solving on the part of industry and the general public and small businesses and anybody with a brainstorm about how to deal with some of these issues, it's this one. So we need public discussion, we need public awareness, we need public initiative, and we need some probably government intervention to facilitate markets to function properly, which they're not doing right now, so that we can harness the creativity of this country and actually address these problems in a useful way. I've been accused on the internet of being the new Debbie Downer. I've been accused of being, Mr. Gloom, the person that you would least want to be in an elevator with, and all kinds of things like that. But I'm not trying to spread doom. What I'm trying to do is make people aware of a whole set of problems that need solution, and also, and here's how I'm going to manage to end on an optimistic note, economic opportunities. I have a list of 8 major economic opportunities that America has before it now. And they are things like flexible reallocation of capacity, which is the business jargon way of describing what the smart grid is really all about and what cloud computing is all about. There are things like mobile information support, providing people with the information they need wherever it is they need it, to expertise kind of electronically on demand. You probably are already acquainted with that with your guidance systems in your automobiles. There's a host of other ways to deliver that further, to press that further, make everybody more productive. So we got a whole set of things like this. I won't go through the whole 8 right now for you. You can invite me back and I'll do the whole 8 another time. Interesting thing about them is they are all right now being held back to a considerable degree by cybersecurity concerns, cybersecurity issues. We would have already all adopted cloud computing a few years ago if it weren't for the security issues. One of the big things that you're not hearing as much about as you maybe should be, that people are worrying about with the smart grid, is the increased security issues that that's generating. So not only can we prevent a lot of really bad things from happening by being creative and entrepreneurial and solving these problems, but we can open up enormous economic opportunities. We can help our economy to get going again, and get going again in advance of some other parts of the world that we don't want leaving us behind. So that's why I'm here, to make more people aware of the huge opportunities here if we solve these problems, if we tackle them, and the terrible dangers if we don't. Thank you. I'll do it. Except I can't see out there. I'm supposed to answer questions. Well, I can see you, so please speak up.
It sounds to me like you believe the private sector is a better way to develop solutions or ways of coping with cyber problems than you believe the government would be able to.
I think the question is, it sounds as though I think the private sector is better able to cope with this than the government. People in this field are fond of saying that private sector owns 85% of critical infrastructure. Actually, that's just a completely made-up number. The real number would be somewhere like 95% or something. Most of critical infrastructure is owned by private sector. Most of the expertise, technical expertise, is in private sector. Our government seems very large, but actually it's not when it comes to these things. So I have nothing against the government. I would love it if the government could solve these problems. They don't have the necessary expertise. They don't have the creative energy. And the kind of creative problem solving that we need is hard to engender in government bureaucracies. Please.
If there were a cyber attack on a country like ours, or Japan or somewhere else, that shut down a large part of the economy, wouldn't that reverberate through the world economy and
yeah, and that's
come back to perhaps the attacker as well? Isn't that a form of mutually assured destruction?
Well, it's not mutually assured destruction, but the fact that it would hurt a lot of the attackers is why it hasn't happened. Right now, there are probably about 20 countries that could get that either have right now the capability of turning off our electric power, frying our generators, or could assemble that capability in a relatively short period of time. But the countries are Britain and France and Germany. They are Japan and China and Russia. Israel is one of the countries that can do that. You get the idea. None of these countries want to do that. The countries that might be tempted to do that kind of attack don't have the capability. And the same is true with other organizations. Al-Qaeda there's been no cyber terrorism as such so far. I hate the word cyber terrorism because we've seen nothing that really could be called cyber terrorism. Al-Qaeda had 5 or 6 senior people who knew something about computers and were trying to make cyber attacks a big part of the future of Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is important not just because of what they've done, but because they're a trailblazer for all the other terrorist groups in the world. Everybody looks to them for leadership, I'm afraid. Partly by chance, partly by attention, we actually killed or captured all of those 5 or 6 people. And since then, Al-Qaeda has not taken any initiative in this area that we can see, that looks like anything of any substance. So if they have acquired the capability, I think they will use it. I think they will do these things. They could, in the next few years, possibly acquire the capability, and I hope to God we have, in the meantime, made these things a lot harder. Another positive note here is because there are groups out there who would like to do horrendous things, and the horrendous things haven't happened, you know we have been staying ahead of them. I worry about us not staying enough ahead. I worry about somebody slipping up and some of these other groups or other countries acquiring these attack capabilities. I'm not worried about China particularly, except that they're stealing all our information out of all our factories and out of all our businesses, and by doing so, stealing entire industries. So I guess I'm pretty worried about China.
To become useless or worthless, right?
Yes. The biggest cyber attack happening today, and the biggest cyber crime, is overwhelmingly theft of business information. Credit card fraud is very small scale compared to theft of business information. Computers and networked production makes it possible to steal all of the information out of a business. We have factories, production facilities, chemical plants, and so on, where all of the schematics, all of the identification of all of the equipment, all of the control systems, all of the settings for all the valves and pressures and things have all been sucked out of the factory. In a similar period of time, factories of the same sort have opened in Southeast Asia. On the day they open, they have had a level of efficiency, presumably, that it took the American or European market leader maybe 6 years to get to. Typically, each year after you open a new facility, start making a new product, you can achieve a 5 to 15% drop in costs, and you can keep that up usually for 6 years, and that's where your profit mostly comes from. If your competitors can steal all that information and be almost caught up to you all the time, you lose all that profit margin, and your whole industry is in jeopardy. So this is like just a really huge deal, and I could have given a whole scary talk about loss of business information, actually, but I thought it would be more interesting to talk about this other stuff. Please. And I see you up there. You're being patient. Thank you.
I'm a 7th grader in Westland, and forgive my innocence, but I was wondering who sat down and, like, developed all of these systems? Like, who came up with the fact that you could shut down all of these systems and practically our whole society if you wanted to? I mean, what the heck?
There are a lot of people out there, and a lot of them are online. In China, there are now 400 million people online, and not all those people are nice. And a lot of the ones that are nice just find it really interesting to figure out how to wreck stuff.
Oh, okay.
And it's kind of a good thing that a lot of nice people do figure out how to wreck stuff, because that way we're protected with advance warning.
Okay,
And by the way, a 7th grader is not necessarily innocent for cyber. I've got a sixth grader daughter, a daughter who's in 6th grade, and she hacks stuff all the time without realizing that's what she's doing. She says, "Oh, Dad, it won't let you copy this way. You have to do it that way." And she circumvents copy protection. She gets access to things. And she says, "Oh, everybody knows how to do this. It's just how you do it." And she has no awareness that she's a little hacker. And you're probably a little hacker and you don't even know it. You're probably not the least bit innocent.
Okay, I have a second question. If there are aliens out there, I have no opinions on this, but if there were, would they be able to, like, shut down the entire world?
If there are aliens out there, I know that we're not going to be able to defeat them by having Jeff Goldblum fly up, or whoever it was, with an Apple Macintosh and plug it into their system and bring down the attack. I think it's probably not going to work. Beyond that, I have no idea.
Okay.
I have not met any space aliens, and I have no idea how they do stuff. Please.
Take it to a personal level. In your home, for your family, what are the things that you do to protect yourself against some of these things so that you're able to make it past 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, etc.? Interested in kind of how you're thinking about it in your own home for your own family.
Well, I'm a target. While I'm speaking, this is my computer. It's right here, behind the podium, so that I can see all the time who's got access to it and who doesn't. I can't do on my machine, because I'm a target, I can't do a lot of the things that the rest of you can on yours. I can't download stuff, I can't watch many videos and things. I have to be very limited in what I do, because I'm tracked, and my colleagues as well, we're all tracked by a bunch of intelligence agencies, and there are a lot of hackers who think, oh, wouldn't it be cool to get into the US Cyber Consequences Unit, and so on. And we do a lot of special security things. We keep a lot of stuff on paper. We keep stuff in different locations. We don't have a single headquarters that would be a target. We make sure that no single one of us knows how to carry out one of these scary attack scenarios I just described to you. Did you all hear that? I don't know how to carry out one of these entire stack scenarios. If you kidnap me, you cannot fry all the generators in North America. You would have to get 3 of my colleagues in addition to me, and you wouldn't know which 3, and a couple of them are ex-special ops guys that would be hard to take down. We have to be really careful. My family, we do the same thing. My kids do the same thing anybody else. They are cautioned very severely about what information they reveal online. We run I can't tell you which one, but everybody should be running McAfee or Symantec or Trend Micro or one of those. But they're only getting generic things. So if you are a scientist, an executive, an engineer, a technologist for a company that is a target company, you need to be thinking about other kinds of precautions. The chief one of which is you need to be watching what your machine is doing and any symptoms that it might have. When I was a kid, there was a thing that came on the television, maybe it does later, I don't know. It said, it's 10 o'clock, do you know where your children are? And I think we should have something today that goes, it's 10 o'clock, do you know what your computer is doing? Or also, it's 10 o'clock, are you sure that computer game your kids are playing, that computer war game, is really a game? Because they might be attacking Georgia.
Thank you. Throughout your presentation, I was curious as to why you never mentioned the word terrorism. And you explained that a little bit, but right after 9/11, I believe there was a report by a study done by several committees where they listed major areas of terrorism, and one of them was cyber terrorism. And that seems to be what you were talking about, cyber attacks, cyber terrorism. And I'm just wondering why you didn't mention it more specifically in your discussion.
We have a lot of cyber attacks going on. We have a lot of cyber attacks that we have to worry about, but so far, terrorist groups are not something we've had to worry about. Also, I don't like the word terrorist, because terrorist takes a lot of groups that have nothing in common except a willingness to use extreme measures, and it lumps them together. And when people start talking about terrorists, they get into a kind of let's insult those sons of bitches, they deserve every mean thing we can say about them kind of vocabulary, kind of atmosphere begins to permeate the discussion. So what we're really talking about are ideological militants, we're talking about ethno-nationalists, we're talking about criminal organizations, we're talking about a number of other different groups that have clearly identifiable goals, capabilities, and other things. And if we start calling them collectively terrorists, it just kind of confuses things. I just don't like the word. You probably use it in a very elegant, accurate way, in which case it would be nice if everybody followed your example.
You didn't have kind things to say about government bureaucracy, but your unit exists. What's the role of traditional intelligence in the battles you're talking about? And is there a credible program, for example, for enlisting a new generation of geeks who are more familiar with this stuff?
Our organization is we're an independent nonprofit 501c3. We were set up at the request of the government. We work only for the government, but we're outside the government because that allows us to avoid some of the government limitations. It allows us, for instance, to get access to inside information of critical infrastructure companies because we can promise to protect that information, chiefly by shredding it, not keeping any of it around very long. And we also conceal their very identities so that we don't reveal who helped us. I have a lot of friends in the government. Obviously, I meet with these people all the time. I have huge respect for them. Howard Schmidt is very competent and a very good guy and was an excellent choice for cybersecurity coordinator. A number of the people in Department of Homeland Security that deal with these issues are people I've known and worked with for years and have huge respect for. The Defense Department has a crew of excellent people. So really, I have huge respect for them. They don't run critical infrastructure. They don't run Silicon Valley. They don't write our software. They don't design our microchips. They don't design our computers. They don't manufacture any of our electronics. They're not doing any of the things in the government that are the core of these issues, the core of these dangers and any of it. I mean, the government is really on the periphery of this subject. So even though they are great people and they can make useful contributions, it's not the center of this. It's not where the action is. I don't know. I don't know if that addressed your question. So I'll move on to somebody else.
In the face of such an attack, you're looking at ultimately defense of your nation as an entity in the worst case scenario. We've already got some sort of plans in place for the nuclear scenario. How much are you able to pull off those type of response plans for infrastructure rebuilding and recovery?
It's a really interesting point. When we've been trying to figure out how we would deal with some of these things, we've actually been going back and unearthing civil defense plans that go back to the late 40s and the 50s, when people were actually making up plans for how do you evacuate cities, how do you feed populations in these crisis situations and things. Most of those plans have not been redone or really even opened up, as far as I can tell, by anybody except for our little gang since way back in the early 60s. I think there's a lot of relevant stuff there. We have to start over and rethink it. But we probably do need some kind of very extensive civil defense system, civil defense thinking. We probably need to be making part of the National Guard a cyber guard. We probably need to be thinking about how can we help put extra personnel into some of these critical infrastructure industries in the event of an attack. We don't have very good plans for these things. There are plans to make plans, to draft plans. But right now, that's as far as we are with cyber, as far as I know. And I actually should know, because I advise on a lot of that.
You're talking about, more to use like a Cold War term, the hardening of our systems. And something that you kind of touched on a little bit earlier in answering of a question is that you decentralized your knowledge of how to destroy a generator. Why would not being decentralizing our infrastructure a little bit better?
There are a lot of ways of decentralizing things that are a very good idea. It's also nice to divide things up into components that are qualitatively different, so the same scalable attack won't work on all the different components. It's nice to remove common avenues of access. It's nice to have everything be just a little less uniform and deducible and so on. Interestingly enough, right now, in order to plug the enormous leaks of information out of the federal government, we are reducing points of access to the internet. We're making everything more uniform. We're providing a common a limited number of access channels. We're automating all the systems. And it's like a prescription to set up the federal government to be a better target for one kind of attack while we are making it harder to carry out another attack. The reason that this is happening is that there is no awareness of a lot of the politicians and senior political people of what's going on here as far as trade-offs and issues and so on, because our country doesn't understand this new world we're moving into very well. Whose turn? I don't remember here. Up above, okay.
Ah, crud, I just blanked. All right. There's a lot of high schoolers, there's a 7th grader, a lot of like people that are going to be the future of this country. What would you suggest, like going to college, majoring to like do your profession or a profession that would help in?
There is no unemployment right now for people in cybersecurity, and if you really have any competence in the field, there hasn't been any unemployment. This is utterly secure field for the time being and for the foreseeable future. We have graduate programs in cybersecurity that are really excellent in America. And in some of them, many years, there are no Americans in the program. They are all Chinese and Indian and people from other countries. We're doing a great job of educating India and China, especially China, at higher levels of cybersecurity. Anecdote here. I'm just thinking, do I want to tell this? Yeah, I can tell this. Maybe if there are any reporters present, you could do me a favor and not put this anecdote in the news. Not at least, or talk to me about it or something. Don't publish this. But a friend of ours, this is a little bit old now, was advising a Chinese graduate student in one of our better cybersecurity programs. And it was the Chinese students, the Chinese student had to pick a dissertation topic. So this guy's the Chinese student's advisor, and he said, okay. He said, have you decided on a dissertation topic? And the Chinese student said he would like to do his doctoral dissertation on the vulnerabilities of the American electric power grid. And the professor said, you know, and he said, you know, he said he'd have great access, he'd be able to get, you know, collect all this great information about it and do real new, groundbreaking work in the vulnerabilities of the power grid. The professor said, this is a true story, this is not a joke. The professor said, you know, you can't do that. You can't come over here and have your specialty be our vulnerabilities. He said, the Chinese student said, why not? That's my specialty. That's what my master's thesis was on. And the implication was that he wasn't alone, that he was part of a population in China whose specialty is the vulnerabilities of the American electric power grid. It's a pretty creepy world where we have America short on technical personnel in these fields and countries like China training large populations. There is great awareness of the need in a bunch of different parts of government for cybersecurity experts. There will be a lot of money made available. Anybody who's going to get into this field in the next few years is going to have a lot of help paying their bills. It's a good field to go into. Just something that occurred to me a minute ago to mention. Before talking about opportunities, we have put all our R&D money for cybersecurity into just a few narrow categories and ignored most of the possibilities. I'll explain briefly. In order to carry out a successful cyber attack, there are 5 things you need to do. You've got to find your target. You've got to penetrate the target. You've got to co-opt it, do something to it. You've got to conceal what you've done long enough so that your actions will have an effect. And you've got to do something irreversible, something where they can't just wind everything backwards. At every stage in our information systems, there are situations where attackers can every stage meaning the hardware, the software, the networking, the human component, the software supply, and all the subdivisions of that. For each of those stages, there are opportunities to carry out each of those 5 stages of an attack. So if you imagine a great grid with, on one side of the grid, the 5 things you have to do to carry out a cyber attack, and on the other side of the grid, all the different components of our information system. That's a comprehensive grid for all the attack steps, all the attack things you can do, and all the defensive measures. When you fill in that grid, which we have done, which I have done, you find that there are attack tools scattered across the whole grid. Every box has got a bunch of things in it from the attack standpoint, but all our defenses are clustered in just a few boxes. It's perimeter defense, trying to get people from breaking into the networks. It's perimeter defense in trying to keep people from using pieces of software they're not authorized to do. So it's a couple of boxes in column 2, second step, and then it's doing backups. It's the reversibility thing, and it's a few boxes there. And otherwise, that whole big grid is mostly empty. Huge R&D opportunities. So if you want career advice, go into cybersecurity, fill in some of those boxes, patent whatever it is you came up with, and sell it off to Symantec or Microsoft or somebody, and retire and feel that you did your duty to your country in the meantime.
Thank you very much for coming here. This is a wonderful talk. I'm an 8th grade science teacher.
Better check my watch, and people start thanking you for coming.
I'm an 8th grade science teacher, and I know that how some of the students can really get through things on the computer. I've seen.
I hope you keep paper grades.
We have at our school. We just had a solar roof put on, and there's a kiosk in the front of the school, and I see the kids all the time playing games on it. So they've learned how to go around the software. But one thing, you're talking about centralizing the power. And one of the things that I've been thinking about with all the new energies that we're doing, especially solar, if we can decentralize the energy where everybody can be supplying their own house, their own currents, then we're less vulnerable.
Huge gain.
Than we would have. And again, it's these large power facilities that create all the pollution too, so we'd be solving 2 problems at once.
Be a huge gain. The problem is, in order to make use of distributed generation effectively, efficiently, we do need smart meters. We do need metering that allows people to feed stuff into the grid as well as feed electricity in, as well as take electricity out. And the really big saving in smart grid is to take the capacity and take our usage and shift it from peak usage times when generation is really expensive to times like the middle of night when extra generation is practically free. So in order to do both of those things, in order to make use of distributed generation and in order to do efficient use of our electrical generation capacity, we need smart meters and we need all of the networking that allows those to operate. Now, as far as we can tell, it is possible from our experiments to attack those smart meters, lock out the utility company, lock out the individual user, and manipulate anything connected to those smart meters any way you want, including cycling the switches fast enough so they will burn out, and in a certain percentage of cases start something on fire. And here the cyber thing I talked about earlier kicks in. Something might only start something on fire 1 out of 1,000 times, but if you can run it on hundreds of thousands or millions of targets, it doesn't matter. You can cause a lot of arson. This, by the way, is another thing I didn't talk about at all until relatively recently. This one I'm talking about not because it's out there being discussed in a bunch of different languages, but because I've sat through one too many meeting where smug people selling smart meters have said, oh, security problems are something we'll take care of later after we've got the contracts and got the stuff installed. We're in danger of having this all come to a grinding halt at some point when somebody exploits this or one of a number of other vulnerabilities. So we've got a paradox here. We've got a technology that will facilitate distributed generation and facilitate other things that will make us less vulnerable. But if we are deploying it oblivious to the cyber risks, we could be setting ourselves up for a horrendous new family of cyber attacks. The only way to get this back on track is if the general public becomes aware enough to be asking questions about the security dimensions of all this and asking the various public figures and authorities who are authorizing this, the commissions and such, about have they addressed the security issues? Are they aware of the security issues?
You just gave me a nice lead-in for my question. In general, I think of myself as a reasonably intelligent and well-informed citizen. But until I read the blurb about your presentation and heard your presentation, I was about as ignorant in the field of cybersecurity, I think, as one could be in this age. I'm woefully aware of the lack of information that I've encountered. So I have two questions. The first one is there a single source or a reasonable number of sources where Joe citizen like me can remain informed on some of the things that are happening in the field? And the second question is, where do you think it makes sense to use my energies to try to apply some sort of motivation to moving ahead in this field?
Gosh, I wish I knew. There are a lot of websites that cover news in this field. A lot of them are pretty good, but there are none that I would immediately recognize, that I would immediately recommend to a general reader. What we really need are the media to habitually cover these kinds of things. Our main publications need to realize that this is a subject of some interest. There are people who are trying hard. Jean Meserve at CNN tries to cover this subject. There are Siobhan Gorman writing for the Wall Street Journal, Ellen Nakashima writing for the Washington Post, John Markoff writing, and so on. Notice, I can say them by name. It's not that I'm so connected to know them all, although I do know them all. It's that the list is so short. You know, Mark Clayton for the Christian Science Monitor, and it's not a lot of people. It's possible to easily list off all of the journalists that are doing consistent work trying to cover this subject. And the reason the list is so short, and the reason that these journalists aren't better known to everybody, although some of them are quite well known, is that the editors don't think there's any public appetite for information on this subject. All of us in the field at a certain level have all been interviewed a lot by television. And most of the interviews never get broadcast because when it comes to the crunch, they think the public is not going to understand it, it's not going to care. So I don't know what to do about it. Just some indication from the public that this is of interest is obviously going to help.
Well, it sounds like you think the media is maybe the channel, and it occurred to me as you were responding that you are currently standing in probably the middle of one of the largest NPR audience groups in the country. So maybe they'll get a few calls.
I'm on NPR periodically, but in these little teeny sound bites. And I'm on CNN periodically, but they interview me for an hour and they use 10 seconds, you know, on Anderson Cooper right at the end of the program or something. I'm supposed to be on CBS Evening News next week. Whether that'll actually happen or not, I don't know. I'm regularly, as are a lot of my colleagues, we're told, oh, you know, this is ready to broadcast, and then it never appears. It just, you know, it gets cut from the program. It's hard to make this television. It's you know, this stuff is and it's easier for kids. It's easier for the 7th grader probably to understand than for a lot of people that are older. Okay, one more question from each place.
It's a very engaging discussion. Just wanted to thank you. I was wondering if you could comment on or kind of go over the basics on how prime numbers were used in internet security.
I think this is probably not a productive thing to address at the end at the end of a session like this. I will say, however, this. Cryptography is a lot less important to cybersecurity than most people think. Most cyber attacks, most theft of information is stealing information from the users while they're using the information, not catching things in transmission. We need good cryptography, and we need to transmit things in encrypted form, and we need to store things in encrypted form. Because if we don't, you can steal it all very easily that way. But you can steal almost all information by other means when somebody's got to de-encrypt it to do something with it. So encryption is just not all that important. Prime numbers are cool, and it's beautiful stuff, just it's beautiful math, and I love it. And by the way, Bruce Schneier's, the shorter of Bruce Schneier's books, the one, not his big fat one, but the shorter one is really excellent on this subject. The one he wrote with, is that the one he wrote with the co-author? Yeah, that's probably the one. That's really excellent. And that's pretty readable for anybody. That's for a student or anybody. And Schneier's very good. We all have huge respect for Bruce.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier in your talk that some of this new malware is able to be introduced into the systems without an internet connection. So is this stuff getting in by somebody plugging some kind of a device into these things?
Yes, yes, yeah. Everything has to be updated and patched and have new data put into it and different things done to it. And anytime you're plugging something in, that becomes an attack tool. Patching procedures are a good way to infect systems. There also are a lot of other opportunities. One last story before I sign off here. When we visit facilities like nuclear generation plants, there are typically people in there who are monitoring these systems 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they're smart people with a lot of education, and they're bored out of their minds. And we regularly ask, ever find anything on this system that isn't supposed to be there? And the answer is hardly ever no. People who are bored, and they're not allowed to bring in books or magazines or computer games or laptops or anything else. They're just supposed to be in there monitoring stuff, switching from one boring screen to another all night long. And they will exercise extraordinary ingenuity into getting things into those systems that shouldn't be there. Computer games, pornographic videos, just stuff. The one that really made us laugh, we found this is about a year, maybe a year and a half ago now, at two quite remote locations, we heard about dedicated programs for writing screenplays in there on the equipment. People were writing the new Hollywood blockbuster when they were supposed to be monitoring, radiation levels or whatever it was. And of course, they are very clever, so they'll arrange it so any other screen is not seeing what they're seeing, and they touch a button if anybody appears, and it's back to what it should be. It never occurs to these people, as far as I can tell, doesn't ever seem to occur to them, that something that is distributed just at large to the general public, to a computer game has for general distribution, could have in it malware targeted specifically at the power grid, specifically at nuclear generation stations, or maybe at a bunch of different targets like that. So one of the things we've been trying to make people aware of recently is that anything you plug in that isn't supposed to be there could be an attack vehicle. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.